I'm Brian Christner, and this is The Byte, a bite-sized podcast about containers, cloud, and tech. Today we will be talking about containers versus VMs. Many people have the misconception that it's versus containers or VMs. I mean, we're really looking at, either it's a container or a VM. However, I must say that they work quite well together. I mean, most instances that we've come across is VMs complement containers. So how do you orchestrate the hardware? I mean, you still need to orchestrate the hardware somehow. And you also need some sort of abstraction where you can install Docker and to be able to spawn off your containers. So in essence, they work well together. I mean, there'll be use cases where VMs will do much better, or it's a better use case, and containers on the other side. But we really need to understand the difference between containers and VMs. So to understand that, there's two types of containers that we currently are using. There's short-lived containers and there's long-lived containers. Now, short-lived containers typically are in production anywhere from 1.5 to 3 days. So that means they're really microservices, they're on a pipeline, and they're changing very frequently. Now, this particular use case is where containers get the most value. They bring the most value to your product, your application, your developers, because you're able to quickly make changes to these applications and bring value very quickly. The other hand, you have long-lived containers. Long-lived containers, they're on the other side of the spectrum. I mean, typically they're around 9 months in production. So they're databases or they're applications that don't do a lot of changes. And when I look at this picture, short-lived and long-lived, you have 9 months versus a couple days. The long-lived side is where I draw a line and say, okay, maybe on the very edge of long-lived is where I would say it's a VM use case, or it's a use case where it's a database, it doesn't change very often, and it doesn't bring a ton of value putting in a container, or it's a huge mission to containerize this specific application, and it doesn't change often. Maybe it's just better to keep it as a VM. Or there's other use cases where I've seen where the database or the actual VM or the container is as large as the VM underneath of it. Now, that's not exactly ideal because you can't move this around. It's hard to have high availability and disaster recovery when your container is the same size as a VM. You basically have a VM container. And I mean, they both have their great use cases. I mean, containers do a great job, but when you orchestrate your hardware with some sort of virtualization, KVM, VMware, whatever, and then you add containers on top of it, it's really the best use case. Now, VMs are typically, an operating system, Windows or Linux, and if we're talking about Windows, I mean, the operating system is around 80 to 100 gigabytes right off the bat. Then add a couple cores, a few gigabytes of RAM, and typically a VM is for one application, or maybe an application stack. But, it's very dedicated to this, so it's hard to say, can I consolidate the resources, or, if the application is just running like 20% CPU, you're not really taking advantage of the resources underneath of it. So that's where the container side comes in. If we can actually optimize the infrastructure and really be able to pack this VM full of containers and optimize the resources underneath, we can actually get maybe 80 to 90% utilization, what we're aiming for. So like I said, we can have a VM running, we can put containers on top. That's the ideal situation. I've actually seen it also where you have bare metal containers where you're running directly on bare metal, which is also a great use case. But I mean, there's tons of use cases. But what we're seeing mostly is containers running on top of a VM, and they're orchestrated. It's the same if you go to cloud. When you go cloud as well, I mean, underneath your cloud instance is some sort of hypervisor. So you're already in a virtualization environment. Your container is running there. Now, if you're using like a managed service, obviously they're taking care of all the virtualization and the hardware orchestration. But that's really what we're talking about today is containers versus VMs. I mean, we shouldn't say verse, we should say complementing each other. So VMs complement containers and vice versa. Let's look at it this way. I mean, they work well together. We can actually treat VMs as containers now, which I'll talk about in a future episode, where there's a couple companies like Weaveworks and Amazon that are treating VMs like containers, which is an interesting concept because then you can orchestrate it kind of the same way and have some sort of orchestrator that makes it work and treats it as a totally different application cycle. That's all for today's episode. Containers versus VMs. Let me know your thoughts on Twitter, and we'll hear you and see you in the next episode. Have a great day. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Byte. You can find the show notes at thebyte.io and follow me on Twitter at I Do My Own Tricks.